Hello, 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 and welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Gregg Blake, one of your co-hosts. I'm so excited to be here this week with my friend and co-host, Matt Freese. Matt, how are you this morning or this
Uh,
afternoon?
yeah, doing great, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Took us a couple of weeks to get this second installment going here on Vikings rookies, but we didn't want camp to get too far along without finishing our evaluations up here. Or finishing work.
Absolutely. We kind of can't have all the news and stuff for camp rolling in before we get this out. It
Yeah,
kind of hurts us a little bit. So
the people need to know. The people need to know.
yes.
We had QB1 Kirk Cousins showing up to camp yesterday, and some of the rookies as well. And so, figure it's the perfect time to talk about them before we start getting all that juicy camp video rolling in, and start getting the buzz about who's showing up, who's showing out.
Yeah, and it really
So,
only took us 3 months to finish this up after the draft. So we're in really good shape here.
hey, listen,
But no, I'm
listen. We're all grown men with grown men jobs, and we're doing the best we can. And we hope our listeners will always be patient with us. Even when it takes us a little while to get
And
some
we
of this.
do promise we will be active during the season. This is kind of the
Yeah, that's the
off-season
goal
doldrums.
right
Once we
now, and I
once we
think
have consistent stuff to talk about, it will be a lot more active. So why don't we dive
yeah.
right in here with Jay Ward, Greg?
All right, let's do it.
So
So
I
wait,
was
just to
yes,
remind everyone, we've been going through the draft by round, starting with the first round. And we got to Jay Ward, which was our fourth round pick. And let's talk about him now, Matt.
yeah, absolutely. So for Ward and for Jaquelin Roy, who we'll get to, I was able to watch. I think it was 5 or 6 games. I have them listed here: Mississippi State, Tennessee, Florida, Ole Miss, Alabama, and Georgia. So really good competition in the SEC, right? I listed some of the best offenses in the country. Ole Miss has a great offense. Typically, Tennessee was one of the best teams in NCAA, and obviously Bama and Georgia are probably the two best teams in college football over the past 5 or so years, right? So really high level competition for the LSU guys, and obviously LSU went to the SEC championship game as well this past season. So
And if
just
I
good.
could piggyback off that a little bit, just to talk about Bama and Georgia a bit, and I think everyone kind of knows this, but the thing that's also kind of special about those defenses is that they run pretty pro systems. It's not like they're running gimmicky defenses or gimmicky
You mean
offenses.
offenses? Yeah,
Yeah, they,
yeah.
they run, pretty. So you see a guy succeed at those schools on either side of the ball, and it's a pretty good bet that they're gonna translate.
Yeah,
So.
Todd Monken obviously was hired as offensive coordinator of the Ravens, and Bill O'Brien was the offensive coordinator at Alabama last year. He's back with the Patriots now after having previously been their offensive coordinator. So both two guys with a ton of NFL experience. Lane at Ole Miss runs more of a collegey offense, but he's got NFL experience as well, and they do some interesting stuff. And a lot more of that spread stuff is creeping into the NFL. So having that experience is helpful. So to go back to Jay Ward, one of the things that you'll note if you look at his like PFF data or anything like that is he was a versatile player, right? They have him as lined up in a multitude of different positions, whether that's safety in the slot, in the box as a deep safety, or even as an outside corner, which was pretty nice to see because it gave us some reps of him there. But I would say that Ward fits best maybe as what I'll call an apex in the NFL, which is a slot corner, or in defenses, it's a player who is between the slot wide receiver and the linebacker level. So he's not quite in the box, but he's got a run fit responsibility to the outside, and he's also got coverage responsibilities usually against the number two receiver in those formations. So my summary with Ward is he's a long physical defensive back, and you really see this in his game when he's making a tackle. Now, at 6 foot, he was only 180 pounds at the combine, right? So we talked about this with Addison and Blackmon in the last episode, where there were both really, really lifer players, both in the 170-pound range. Ward, is a bit taller than the other two, but he's still really light for his frame. And this was, I've heard some from people who are at minicamp and at OTAs in on other Vikings podcasts, frankly, that he was kind of a skinny player and he looked like he wasn't up to NFL weight. So that's definitely something to watch out for as training camp progresses, if that's something where he's going to need a year in an NFL weight room or if he's going to be ready to play right away. And the other concern, as I talked about with both Addison and Blackmon, is that USC may not be, USC is one of the most well-resourced schools in college football, right? LSU probably has more resources than USC does, probably has better facilities than USC does. So, if you're not able to put on weight in that strength program, that could be a problem for translating to the NFL. So it is definitely a question. With that being said, once again, as we kind of talked about with Addison and Blackmon, players are trending smaller in the NFL. So it could be just kind of an artifact of the past and something we don't need to worry about as strongly. But Ward really uses that physicality coming up towards the line of scrimmage and run defense. He hits guys really hard, and he's really aggressive in run defense. And actually, I think does a good job, despite his small size, in terms of getting on the guys on the ground and making tackles. He's got decent length for a corner too, so he can press guys at the line of scrimmage. He showed press ability on the outside as well as from the slot. So I think that cornerback versatility, while it's not something I expect him to major in the NFL, it's something that should help him cover tight ends at the NFL level, which I think is hopefully, something he can do very well. So I kind of project him a little bit as a tight end eraser. He doesn't have elite long speed. If you look at his RAS, he was a little bit low on the long speed. I think he ran let me pull it up here. I apologize. He ran a 4.55, which is fine, right? Especially for a safety, but it's not great long speed, and you'd want a corner to run a little bit faster than that. So, he's got the NFL caliber. So he doesn't quite have the NFL caliber speed to play corner. He doesn't quite have the NFL caliber quickness to play corner, but again, he can kind of man up against tight ends rather than wide receivers necessarily. I will say when he is backpedaling and when he is trying to match routes, he'll often play off of his back foot and not be able to drive forward and match the routes. So it very well could be that it's a technique issue that's preventing him from being as quick as he could be, rather than just a lack of ability to do so. But I'd be interested to see if that gets corrected at the NFL level. Another thing, and this is kind of true with all college defensive backs, is that when he loses, he's very grabby. Especially in the Ole Miss game, I believe there were like 2 or 3 plays in a row where he lost, and he kind of should have been flagged or would have been flagged at the NFL level in those scenarios, but he just wasn't. But again, that comes back to the physicality. That comes back to being able to match up with tight ends. You can usually get away with a bit more against tight ends than you can against wide receivers at the NFL level. So it'll be interesting to see if that's a role he's able to gain. I would say that Ward is actually, he shows to be a pretty smart player on tape. He's got a good instinctive feel for zones where he needs to be. He's broken up a couple of passes in that way. With his eyes in the backfield, he also got an interception and was able to drive on passes and kind of click and close on defenders running curl routes and that sort of thing. So I thought he did a very good job there. Like I said before, he aggressively tacks upfield against wide receiver and tight end blocks. Like, he kind of can blow those guys out of the water because he's coming at them with high speed and then take on a ball carrier. In some cases, he doesn't wrap up very well. He kind of goes for a big hit rather than wrapping. So that's something you'd like to see. And like I said with Ward's frame, he's not going to be able to take on linemen and stalemate them one-on-one, right? That's a rare trait for a safety. That's something maybe you could see Harrison Smith do, right? Who's a sturdier player than Ward is, but it's not something a ton of NFL safeties are going to do. So he's going to have to sidestep that, and that could open run lanes further. I will say, also sometimes in run defense, he's not as technically sound as he could be. So when you're a force player in run defense, which oftentimes you're outside corner, or sometimes in Ward's case, the slot corner, you need to stay as far outside as possible to force the run back into pursuit, which means you need to take on the outside shoulder of the widest blocker or any blocker coming towards you. Ward will sometimes jump a gap and try to go inside and try to take on the inside shoulder. And that's a problem because it allows the runner to go outside. I think I talked about this with Mekhi Blackmon as well against Tulane, who had Tyjae Spears, where he did it. Ward's doing the exact same thing, where he's trying to jump inside. It allows the runner to cut outside and go away from linebacker pursuit. You want to force that running back to cut back inside and into the linebacker pursuit who are coming across the line. So that's another problem with Ward. All that being said, you combine all of those things. I think you end up with a player who could see the field right away in a very specific role, right? I've talked about that tight end eraser role. I think he's got the height. I think he's got the length to do it. I think he's got the competitive toughness to do it, right? I think he's competitive enough to stick in there against tight ends. I don't think that he's necessarily going to out physical a lot of tight ends, and maybe that becomes an issue at the catch point. That's something we'd have to see at the NFL level, but I think he does a good job at the catch point in terms of playing with physicality, getting his arms, and using his length to his advantage at the catch point, which I think could help him against tight ends as well. The Vikings have a pretty deep defensive backroom. Well, I shouldn't say that. Vikings have a safety room with a bunch of guys who we expect might see the field, right? You have Harrison Smith, Cam Bynum, you have Josh Metellus, and Josh Metellus has gotten a ton of steam as that kind of tight end eraser sort of deal, right? And then you have Lewis Cine, right? So Ward's really the fifth safety there, who's a first-round pick who we haven't really seen on the field all that much. So, Ward is kind of the odd man out in that mix, so it may be a year or two before he's kind of up to an NFL weight and ready to compete at an NFL level. But even with the deep safety room, we have a very light cornerback room, right? We only really have one bona fide starter in Byron Murphy, and then it's three young players who are competing for two starting spots with Booth, Mekhi Blackmon, and Caleb Evans, right? So we may try to get more safeties in the nickel mix, and that might be Josh Metellus, but it might also be Jay Ward if the team really ends up liking him there. So that's kind of where I see him slotting in early on, and then my hope is that he can develop into somebody who becomes a tight end eraser in the league, I would say. And he's got the versatility to play deep safety as well. Like, he played deep safety, he's good at reading quarterbacks. I wouldn't say that he's an Earl Thomas who's a true center fielder as a deep safety, but in quarters, in cover two, I think he can do a half field deep safety pretty well.
Matt, it seems to me like at least what Brian Flores is inheriting from what we had last year and from some of what I've heard listening to you about our draft so far on the defensive side of the ball. It seems like we're kind of stacking up these tweener guys almost at every level, where it's like there is they don't quite fit into a very specific role. Do you feel like, based on our conversations about the Flores defense, do you feel like it fits what you've seen from what he's run in the past, that we're doing things that you kind of expected, or are these guys kind of like, I didn't expect that player to be attractive to us, that's interesting? Or
yeah, I would say that with most of the guys we added on defense in the draft and the guys we added through free agency, I actually see very specific Flores roles for them. Like, that tight end eraser role is something that existed in the Patriots defense when Flores was there. I'm not sure it quite existed in the Dolphins defense, but like, the Patriots would use, Devin McCourty and Duron Harmon, as their deep safety, and Duron Harmon as their box safety, with Patrick Chung a lot of the time as well, playing kind of that man coverage safety role in dime packages. So they'd have three safeties on the field at the same time, and I can see him doing that. I can also see Metellus doing that. The thing that concerns me a little bit is there's two ways this can go, right? Where a player like Jay Ward is a jack of all trades, right? He does a variety of things, but a master of none, rather. which is a problem because overall you're just generally not very good then, right? Like if you're okay at 5 different things, that adds some value, but you'd rather have a player who's elite at one thing, right? And use him in that specific role every single time. Devin McCourty for the Patriots being a great example of an elite, deep center field safety, who was great for a very long time with them. Now, the problem I have is the Vikings defense. Like I see specific roles for a lot of these players. We'll get into Jaquelin Roy as well. I see a very specific role for him, and I can bring you a Patriots comp for him as well. But and a guy who played for both the Patriots and the Dolphins. But ultimately, I'm not sure he's going to be an every down player. And I think the Vikings have a bunch of players who I can see a specific role for and have questions of whether or not they're going to be every down players. So that can go one of two ways, right? Flores puts all of these guys in fields in random places. You have like 15 guys getting a relatively equal share of the snaps, right? Of the 11 guys on defense, you got a constant rotation going on, and it actually works out. That type of rotation leads to us being too predictable on defenses. Offenses figure it out, and it doesn't work. You have guys who I project to be role players who actually step up and can become full-time starters, and that works really well. Or you have guys who I project to be role players who are only good in a specific role, who are forced into full-time starting roles because there's no better option, and that goes poorly, right? So it really can go any way, I think, and I think there are a couple of paths for us to get in those directions. I'm just kind of excited to see how it plays out because I don't really think there's a good way to predict how that will go prior to the season.
Right. And no matter how it goes, I think we all know what kind of a defense he inherited. So it's going to be hard to hold any performance against him.
Yeah,
So,
with the lack of bona fide star power on this defensive roster, right? And the star power that we do have being aging or having injury questions or that sort of thing, or, holding in a camp or whatever, we really need to, we need young guys to step up. Fortunately, there are a ton of young guys on this defense, right? Like nobody, Byron Murphy, I think, is like 25, and he's the oldest person in the cornerback room. And the other safeties besides Harrison Smith, like he might be the oldest person of everybody besides Harrison Smith of the defensive backs, So there's a lot of youth, and hopefully guys can step up because you can pull guys out of nowhere and end up having them start in the NFL if you get a good enough competition going.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a little teaser of our 2023 season preview show, which will be coming along some point here during the preseason. Okay, well, to that end, we need young players. We need young players that fit roles that you recognize on Flores defense. Let's talk about Jaquelin Roy, our 5th round draft pick. Big boy, 6'3", 310 or something like that. The last time he was
310 or so.
Yeah,
At the combine, he was 305. So
305.
6'3" and a half, 305, basically.
Still pretty big.
Yeah.
Bigger than a lot of defensive tackles that I think we've been putting out there in recent years. We've kind of been undersized at that position. So I'm happy to see some size coming in. Tell us a little bit about Jaquelin Roy and what you see, and give us that comparable. I want to know who you think he reminds you of.
Yeah, so Roy was actually a really highly touted player coming out of high school. He was the number 2 recruit in the state of Louisiana. He was a 4-star recruit, obviously chose home state LSU. I think a lot of people growing up in the Louisiana area, dream of going to the LSU, so that's no surprise. And his first year was the year after they won the national championship, right? So he did not overlap with Justin Jefferson, but, he came in, with high expectations and a team that had high expectations, right? Just coming off of a national championship. He was able to get in immediately as a true freshman in 2020 and then started in both 2021 and 2022. PFF at one point actually had him mocked as a 1st round pick for this draft. the offseason prior, right? So after the 2022 draft, when everybody's coming out with their way too early mock drafts, PFF had him as a first round pick. They had him really highly graded as a pass rusher in the 2021 season. So, he was considered up there with, not up there with Jalen Carter, right? But he was considered in the tier right after Jalen Carter after the 2021 season, from a PFF perspective, at least, right? I don't know if many other outlets had him that high, but they really liked him.
PFF is always walking to the beat of their own drum. We'll put it that way.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, Roy did not test very well at the combine, and that's definitely going to be a concern for him going to the NFL. So his RAS, which we've talked about for a bunch of these projects, or for a bunch of these prospects, was just 3.71. And that's really that's on a scale from 0 to 10, right? So anything below 5 is a really bad score for an NFL prospect, because the RAS database includes a bunch of players who never even sniffed the NFL, right? It's guys who went to the combine. It's guys who even had pro days, right? Who were NFL hopefuls that were there. So, being only in the 37th percentile is very poor. And it's not something like he is huge, right? 305 is a decent size for a defensive tackle, but it's, it's relatively average, right? It's not like he's a 350 pounder who is putting up poor athletic testing.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a concern. With Roy, I saw somebody who's a stout player. He's got a good frame to play interior defensive line. He played a lot as a nose tackle, or he played occasionally as a 3 technique, right? But he played a lot as a nose tackle, and he really did a good job holding against individual blockers. Like, he extremely rarely gave ground against opposing offensive linemen. And like I talked about with Jay Ward, this is going against a high level of competition. These are relatively high. Obviously, it's not an NFL level offensive line he's going against every time. But, you have talented players and bigger players who are going to be more powerful than you would at, say, if you're at a group of 5 school, right? So if you're in the Sun Belt and you're a defensive tackle who's regularly holding up against opposing offensive linemen, that's not going to be nearly as impressive as doing it in the SEC. So I did like that. He holds his ground, maintains his gap against blockers. He's got strong hands that allow him to disengage. I thought his hand usage was really good, and he can lock out a primary gap. This is called a lock peek shed technique, where he locks out his opponent in a primary gap in a 1-gap defense, sees the running back go to the gap to the side of him, and sheds the offensive lineman the other direction so he jumps into that other gap. That's something the Vikings were using last year with the gap and a half technique under Donatel. The Fangio defenses use it. The Georgia defense uses it as well. The Saban tree kind of uses it. Belichick has traditionally kept to more of a 2-gap/1-gap, but I expect that Flores might try to use that in some scenarios as well, if you have 2 deep safeties. Now, it's not as necessary to do that when you're playing with the safety in the box, which the Flores defense does more than anybody, so I'm not sure if that skill is going to be awesome, but his ability to hold his ground and then defeat and disengage from blocks is impressive, and something that's going to be useful in any defense, in run defense. So he's got good strength, so he can make a single arm tackle of a running back while being blocked. It's pretty impressive. He's got some quickness to his game, right? His testing doesn't really show it, but he can exploit missed assignments from linemen and get into the backfield. I will say, go ahead.
I like to call that move the Pat Williams.
Yes.
The one arm stop the running back.
Yes, absolutely. Just stop the guy dead in his tracks, because you're just a stone wall, right?
Right.
So I will say, against double teams, Roy has a tendency to play too high. So I talked about his ability to beat single blockers, but he got pushed back on multiple occasions against double teams, which is a concern for me at the next level, right? If I'm asking somebody who I don't think has a ton of juice as a player based on his athletic testing to be on the field, he's somebody I'd want to be able to take on and easily defeat double team blocks. At 305, that's not something you'd profile Roy off the cuff of being able to do. But I'll get into why I think that can be acceptable in the Florida's defense a little bit here. I do think the lack of quickness shows up on tape as a pass rusher. He often fails to push the pocket against double teams as a pass rusher. So as an interior defensive lineman, you tend to face a bunch of double teams, just naturally between the center and guard, especially if you're lined up over the center. Offensive teams, we see this with Garrett Bradbury, like to help their center because it's harder for the center to pass protect than it is for the guards to pass protect because he has to physically snap the ball at the snap, right? That kind of sets him behind a little bit. And it's more pronounced at the college level where the centers aren't necessarily as skilled as they are at the NFL level. So I would say he generally has pretty good hand technique. I mentioned that in the run game. I think that's true in the pass game as well. But he's a little bit stiff as a rusher too. So as a 3 technique, he doesn't necessarily have the bend to get around the corner, which you might see from a more spread out on a 3rd down defensive line. Typically we think of edges cornering, but defensive tackles sometimes have to do that against guards as well, depending on the rush plan. Where I think he's best, though, is stunts. I think he's quick enough to crash on stunts, and I think he's also, good enough with his hands when he's looping on stunts to be able to use a swim move or something to make the opponent miss, kind of when he has more space to work with, which a stunt kind of opens up space for the player to get to. I think he's instinctive as well. Like I mentioned above, in the run game, he knows where the running back is going, and he plays gap sound football while still being able to work his way over to the running back. So he can kind of bait running backs as well. That lock peek shed technique kind of helps bait running backs, where you look in one gap, the running back sees that, he says, I'm going to go to the other gap, and then all of a sudden you move the offensive lineman, and where he thought there was going to be a gap, he's not there. So with all of that being said, the specific player I have in mind who played in both the Flores and Belichick defenses is Adam Butler. So that's not exactly an exciting name, but
what a letdown!
I know, right?
I was so excited. Who's the comp? I know. Please continue.
It's not exactly an exciting name, but he played a bunch of snaps for the Patriots, and he played a bunch of snaps for the Dolphins. If you know anything about the Patriots defenses over the last since Bill Belichick's been there, they've been pretty good. And the specific package that the Patriots like to use Butler in is what was called their 5-0 package. It's where you have, or odd Mac 0. It's where you have 5 players on the line of scrimmage. 1 is typically a lighter defensive tackle. 2 are your edge rushers or your base defensive ends, depending. And 2 are linebackers, okay? So for Roy, I think his best role is really going to be as a nose tackle in those fronts. So you get him on stunts, you get him to be able to crash and maybe potentially overpower some players, you get him with the ability to loop around, and he's a good enough run defender that when you're in a 5-man front like that, the offensive line struggles to double team. I mean, this is kind of how it's killed the Vikings outside zone run game, right? It's killed the Rams outside zone run game in the Super Bowl. Now, that was somewhat a 6-1, but the 5-0 where you have a man up against every single lineman really hurts your ability to run the ball. So I think Roy would work really well in those scenarios where he's asked to stunt a lot as a pass rusher, right, and can create pressure that way rather than being asked to win one-on-one, because while he did really well his sophomore year of college, right, in 2021, I think a lot of the pressures were frankly manufactured rather than something that Roy was doing where he was overpowering opposing players. So I think putting him into advantageous situations like that can take advantage of his skill set. So that's kind of where I see Roy. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, right? I think that he will be a rotational player to start if he sees snaps. Obviously Harrison Phillips is a starter. We brought in Dean Lowry, who I expect to see a significant amount of snaps. And Khyiris Tonga, I think, is very serviceable as a nose tackle. We have other options on that defensive line, right? Eseze Otomoyelo from last year. James Lynch is still on the team as well. Jonathan Bullard is there. So there's a stable of names there, right? And I think for Roy to be able to push for snaps, he has to show that he's going to be useful in that 5-0 package, and that's where I'd kind of project him.
Okay. Well, every defense needs role players and supporting players, and who knows? Maybe he'll surprise us, right? Maybe he'll pop once he
And
gets out.
and we kind of have to keep these things in perspective, right? Because Roy was a 5th-round pick. You're not exactly expecting a starting caliber player from a 5th-round pick right away.
Now let's move into our next our next player here, because there's a few people in the Vikings fan base who would disagree with you there when discussing our next our 6th round pick, Jaren Hall, who is a quarterback. There's some people who might think he could start for us. So, Matt, why don't we just barrel right through this here? Let's talk about
Um,
Jaren Hall. I have thoughts on Jaren Hall, but I'll wait till you give us your much more level-headed point of view on this player.
okay, so first, like, if anybody is suggesting that Jaren Hall is a better quarterback than Kirk Cousins right now, that's kind of ridiculous, right?
I
Like,
don't think anybody. Sorry, I didn't mean
uh,
to present it as though that was the case. I don't think anybody is.
okay,
Just to be
yeah, like, I mean, I understand certainly the idea the Vikings drafted Jaren Hall. They want to see what they have in him, and maybe he's somebody who can be a bridge player, or even I think he has the potential to be an NFL starter, right? I don't think he's there right now, and I think that his tools maybe are not quite high end enough to be a true NFL starter. So that'll preface it, I suppose. But yeah, I think if you're thinking there's no reason Jaren Hall should see the field right now, right this year, which is okay. He's a rookie now. He is also an older rookie. He's 25 years old. Um, and that's because he went on a Mormon mission, as many players in BYU do. So he ended up becoming an older player coming out of school.
at
Um,
5 years at BYU.
yeah, so he actually started at BYU in 2018, which I guess would mean 5 years at BYU. Yeah, obviously he sat behind Zach Wilson, who was the number 2 overall pick for a couple years in 2019 and 2020, I suppose. I think he got injured in 2018. And then
Well, notably terrible quarterback.
yeah, I mean, obviously Wilson has not panned out in the NFL, but there was talent there to make him go number 2 overall. So I don't think it's really a knock on Hall to say he sat behind a player who's the number 2 overall pick in the NFL draft, even if Zach Wilson since then has not panned out, right? Like, it was obviously working for BYU at the time, so why would they go with something different? But Hall was the starter the last 2 seasons after Wilson left, so we have a pretty decent sample on which to evaluate him. I only was able to find 3 BYU games against Oregon, Notre Dame, and Boise State. Now, all 3 of those are pretty solid competition, especially for a BYU team that in Zach Wilson's year went 7-0 playing or 11-0 playing absolutely nobody's. The best opponent they had was Coastal Carolina that year, basically, right? So Notre Dame, Oregon, Boise State, a lot better level of opponents than what Zach Wilson was playing when he got drafted very high. So for Hall as a player, I think he has excellent short accuracy, good intermediate accuracy, and mobile accuracy as well. He struggles with deep accuracy. I don't think he has great arm strength. Like, he's got an NFL caliber arm from my perspective, but he doesn't have a top-notch NFL arm, right? It's approaching the Teddy Bridgewater level of NFL arm. More so than it is, your Aaron Rodgers or your Patrick Mahomes's. So definitely, somewhat of an issue there. He's a smaller player as well. So he is, he measured in a 6'1", 207, which is both short and light for a quarterback. Now, that being said, he ran a 4.6 40-yard dash, right? So he's quick and he's a good runner. And in college, he was very effective as a runner as well. So one of the things I liked about Hall's tape in particular is he runs NFL concepts, or at least he does NFL style things, right? The BYU offense is an outside zone offense. He did end up playing, I would say, primarily in pistol and shotgun, but he had some under center stuff as well, which is important because sometimes quarterbacks come out and they haven't played under center their entire lives, right? They were in high school in a shotgun offense and they were in college in a shotgun offense. One of the silliest things to me, and it makes sense when you think about it, but it just looks silly, is when a college team takes a shotgun snap to kneel the ball, right? Like, it's just like, okay, yeah, they haven't practiced the quarterback center exchange, so there's actually less risk of the fumble with them snapping it back to the quarterback, at shotgun depth than there is under center. But it's still kind of crazy to me, right? Hall doesn't have that negative of he can go under center and run that. And we know that Kevin O'Connell is going to run that, run the ball from under center and run play action from under center. That's some of the most lethal play action you get is the rollouts from under center. So I would say that, like I said, he's got adequate arm strength, but when he's unable to get his base together, he doesn't have good arm strength. So he needs a clean pocket and he needs to be able to step into throws to get a good velocity on his throws, which is something that's not untrue for players in the NFL, but it's just something to note as a little bit of a negative, where it's not going to be. He's never going to be a Patrick Mahomes type thrower who can put the ball in any location from any angle, or Aaron Rodgers or Josh Allen. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the type of ceiling that we're looking at here for Hall as a player. The height thing also becomes an issue sometimes where he has to angle passes a little bit high. This is true for all shorter players. It's just something that exists. Many players have been able to work around it, and I think, the complete aversion that the NFL had many years ago to players that were as short as Hall, 6 foot tall players, is, overlooking their better qualities and kind of just applying an arbitrary threshold. But it is something to note with players as well. I like Hall's anticipation, and I like his willingness to trust his receivers. He trusts his receivers very heavily in one-on-one situations to win. That's something we see out of Kirk Cousins very consistently. I think Hall is very good at anticipation. He can see routes that are going to break open over the middle, that are going to wrap around linebackers. He can release the ball and start his throwing motion before that player actually comes open. That's a very important thing for the NFL level, for players to have that type of anticipation. He understands coverages pretty well. I think he, manipulates coverages in a way that allow him to anticipate throws and make him look good in terms of the anticipation there. And he makes good pre-snap reads as well. So, from a technique standpoint, I like his dropbacks. I think he's pretty good in terms of his drop back footwork. He's generally very consistent about the depths that he goes to in drops backs. And this is something that Kirk Cousins does incredibly, incredibly well. Kirk is very consistent at where he lands with his back foot on his drop back based on the step footwork. And that's something that doesn't get talked about a ton, but it actually helps out your offensive line and particularly your offensive tackles a lot, because some quarterbacks will drift back very far and drop back, 10, 11 yards on a standard drop back when the tackle's only supposed to block to 8 or 9 yards of depth. So a lot of times offensive tackles, they're taught, the quarterback is supposed to drop back to 8 yards here. You need to block a guy to 10 yards of depth. So if he runs around you and it gets to 10 yards, don't worry about it. If a quarterback isn't precise with his footwork, that can cause issues. Kirk Cousins is extremely precise and consistent with his quarterback, and Hall isn't quite as precise, but I do think that's something that bodes well and something that he can hone in on at the NFL level and get better at it if he has to play for a significant amount of time. One thing I do have a bit of an issue with is his tendency to drift right in the pocket. I've noticed it on a couple plays, particularly where he ended up going into pressure or into blitzes that caused issues. There was a safety he took where he drifted right and ended up getting sacked on the play into a blitz where his running back was blocking an edge rusher. Right, so in that scenario, you don't want to end up to your right. There was another play where he drifted right. I think he threw an interception. It might have just been a tipped pass against Boise State, where he slid right directly where 2 linemen were pushed back, and there was an option for him to move up into the pocket. So the throw ended up going high because he had to try to get it over the linemen who were being pushed back by defensive linemen. So, I think that's an issue. Against pressure, I think he can sidestep pressure. He can escape the pocket under duress. I talked about some of my concerns with him dealing with pressure in terms of him drifting in the pocket, but I think that's something that can get cleaned up at the NFL level. And I think he's a better pocket manager than maybe a lot of college quarterbacks are coming out. I think Hall's a good athlete for the position as a runner. He's got the ability to make linebackers miss in space. He's not going to make defensive backs miss in space, right? He's not a Lamar Jackson level runner. He's not a Anthony Richardson level runner, but he's a quality NFL runner at the quarterback position. I think his speed allows him to escape the pocket effectively. On design runs, he manipulates defenders on option plays. He runs option plays well. He can read blockers and make the correct cuts with space in front of him. There's a really impressive 60-yard design, I think it was a design run, that he had against Boise State as well, where he manipulates players on the second level. He understands where his blockers are going to go on the second level, and he follows them to a lot of success. Another thing I like about him is that he protects himself and goes down easily to minimize contact, but he also ramped it up when it mattered. Right. So you want quarterbacks to slide. You want quarterbacks to get out of bounds. You want them to minimize contact from defenders. You don't want your quarterback taking big hits, right? Because that's how they get hurt at the quarterback position. If you watch Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson, they have an uncanny ability to avoid big hits while they're running as well. And Hall, again, he's not that level runner, but he does avoid big hits. And then in critical game situations, there were a couple critical game situations, he will also lower the shoulder and try to run over players, right? So he kind of has a feel for the situation and can react appropriately based on that situation. I like that for him as a runner. So an overall summary for him, right? I think he's significantly developed from the mental side of the game. I mean, I guess I would hope so as a prospect who's an older prospect at 25 years old. I think that he's got very strong accuracy. One thing I didn't mention is that he's got very good footwork on one-step drops and throws to screen, and he's very consistent on throws behind the line of scrimmage. He was very rarely inaccurate on throws behind the line of scrimmage, and those are throws that we expect players should hit every single time, but it's rare that a player actually does hit those throws every single time, and Hall basically does that. So I did like that. I like the intermediate accuracy. I think the deep ball and the deep accuracy is a little bit questionable, especially once you get past the 25-yard range. So he's not going to be, chucking bombs. When he's got intermediate deep accuracy, I'd say, the 15 to 30-yard range, he's pretty good, or the 20 to 30-yard range, he's pretty good. Once you get beyond that 30-yard range, it becomes a problem for him. So for me, I think Hall is probably a player who you would see lifted up by the system that he's in if he's in a high-quality offensive system, who can be an adequate starter for an NFL team, but doesn't really have the ceiling of being a high-level starter that maybe we're seeking to surpass the Kirk Cousins, right? The rushing ability adds a little bit of an X factor, but if you're asking me for his ceiling, I do think it's in that mid-tier quarterback range. Now, when you're paying a mid-tier quarterback a rookie fifth-round pick contract as opposed to $35 million a year, that kind of eases that pain a little bit. But I don't think he's going to be a long-term answer as a player. I think he's more of a bridge player or somebody who can develop into a quality backup. And I think from the mental side, he definitely has the ability to develop into a long-term backup in the NFL. A guy who helps out the quarterback room immensely and can do a couple things if he gets in there.
Let's be clear. That is his ceiling. There's no reason to discuss him beyond that, in my opinion. But yeah, I agree with you there 100% for sure.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on Jaren Hall? I know I just kind of filibustered you to death there, Greg, but
no, you said it all. You said it all. For me, it's the age, the completely almost anonymous college career. Just nothing really to discuss here. I think he could be a very solid backup in the NFL, and that's great. I mean, there's very few players who even can get to that level and stay a backup. And we've seen a lot of these guys come through. Minnesota Vikings fans have, where we think maybe there's something there, and they're gone within a year or something. So it would be great if he could stick around and contribute to the team, and it's great. You can't expect a whole lot more from a sixth-round quarterback pick. There's only one Tom Brady, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there's more stuff to unlock. I think it's a good idea to continually draft quarterbacks, right? Because when you do hit on a Tom Brady, when you do hit on a fourth-round Kirk Cousins, when you do hit on a Dak Prescott, they're just so immensely valuable. So you want to add that talent and have a continuing, influx of young talent to the room. And honestly, of the quarterbacks this year, I like DTR too, but I wasn't too impressed with the late round quarterback prospects outside of, the top really four guys. And like I'd say that I'd rather have, Jaren Hall in the fifth is way better to me than Will Levis or Hendon Hooker in the first.
Oh my
From
God,
a,
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, Will Levis, I can see with the tools you take the shot, right? And I kind of talked about maybe it makes sense for the Vikings to do that, but I didn't like him as a quarterback prospect, so I'm kind of glad that they didn't, and I didn't have to like hope
I'm
that
on the
this guy
record.
pans out.
I'm on the record about Will Levis, so we don't even have to go there.
Yeah,
I really wanted Dorian Thompson Robinson. I agree with you though that the um, it's always great to add quarterbacks. I think even if you have your guy as your starter, even if he's young, I think it's still a good idea to
yeah,
add a quarterback every couple of years. And the only caveat to that for me is I think age really, really matters, especially as the rounds get later. Like I really want a guy who has, you know, potential and like a high ceiling, but that Jaren Hall is Jaren Hall. It's fine. It's fine. It's good.
yeah.
6th round pick, it's solid. There's no problem. Um, all right, we got two more guys left to talk about, Matt. Are you ready to move on?
Yes, absolutely. Let's hit up DeWayne McBride, running back,
Now,
UAB.
now
Uh,
there's a huge gap in the running back room, and there's a lot of people who think DeWayne McBride has a chance to at least compete, or contribute to fill in that gap. How do you feel, Matt? And I think I know where you're headed with this, but we haven't actually really spoken about it, so I'm curious. What do you think of DeWayne
yeah,
McBride?
so I like Dwayne McBride as a runner, and particularly as a college runner. I mean, obviously, he was extremely effective in college. He was second in FBS last year with 1,713 rushing yards. He tied for third in rushing touchdowns with 19, and third in yards per carry with 7.4, right? Like, this guy was running over the competition. Now, a lot of that was lower level competition. He played teams like Liberty, Georgia Southern, Western Kentucky. Those are the games I was able to find. I was also able to find a game against LSU, and that had, Jaquelin Roy and Jay Ward, who we talked about before, but it's a high level of competition for running backs in particular. I like to see them against high level of competition, especially if they play for a school like a UAB, where I get to see how they do with an offensive line that isn't blocking well for them, right? Because a lot of time you get these productive rushers, and they have a particularly good offensive line. And we know that offensive line play is heavily responsible for running back production, right?
Can,
Like,
can I give you a really good example of the opposite? Was Isaiah Pacheco from last year. Like
yeah,
we talked about him. I
yeah,
love
because he's playing at Rutgers in the Big Ten, and in the Big Ten
first off,
East, where you get to go against Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and get absolutely decimated every week by if you're Rutgers, right? So,
they had the worst offensive line in college, literally, by pretty much any grade. And I remember watching Pacheco and going, there's something here. Like there's something here. I
yeah,
don't know what it is exactly, and it's almost impossible to tell because the line is so bad. But so that's sort of like both sides of the coin, right? Like you're absolutely right. Some guys produce in college because they're running behind five blue chippers, and it's just like
yeah.
easy. But anyway, please continue. I
Yeah,
just wanted to.
so McBride, some more stats just to show you how incredibly productive this guy was. Third in the FBS with 25 rushes over 15 yards. Third in total yards after contact with over 1,000 yards after contact. 4.6 yards after contact per attempt, and 74 missed tackles. That 4.6 was second in the FBS, and the 74 missed tackles forced or broken tackles was seventh in the FBS. Those stats were per PFF. So, just incredibly productive and very elusive and very good after contact, which is something that you look for in running backs. Now, frankly, a lot of that after contact work was against defenses and linebackers that were terrible. You watch the Liberty game, and it's like, what are these linebackers even doing? And that guy coaches at Auburn now, so great, really good job. Just college football in general for getting gross coaches back into the mix. I digress. I apologize. So to focus on DeWayne McBride, I think he does a really good job on gap scheme runs. Like, he understands where his blockers are going to go. He understands how to cut off of his blockers. He understands how to manipulate linebackers in the gap scheme runs. In the zone runs, I think he's a little bit too patient. I think he could make his decision faster. There's an old Alex Gibbs clinic who basically invented the zone running game. He was the offensive line coach for the Broncos back with Mike Shanahan when they were running over the league with Terrell Davis. And in that video, basically he says the running back basically should have decided where he's going to go by his third step after carrying the ball. You'll see McBride get a lot closer to the line of scrimmage before trying to make a cut or avoid backfield penetration when he's running zone schemes. So I do think that's a concern and something we'll have to get better at, because obviously the Vikings are going to be primarily a zone running team. I think we're going to mix in a lot more gap runs this year, but we're going to be primarily zone. Like I said, McBride does a good job of manipulating linebackers and safeties at the second level. And that's part of vision, and that's part of the nuance of the running back position. I think he's got great contact balance. He works through arm tackles from defensive tackles. He bounces off direct hits and runs through wraps by linebackers. And that includes in the LSU game, so it's not just against the lower levels of competition. I do think that he's going to be able to break some tackles in the NFL, although it won't be nearly as consistent as he was in college. I don't think any runner who gets the NFL level can break tackles at the rate that McBride did in college, because he broke them at an absolutely absurd rate. He maintains his balance well through low hits. He lowers his pads to gain yardage. He also tends to run upright a little bit, and his tending to run upright is more to make additional players miss, right? He's so good at breaking through arm tackles and some wraps by defenders that when he does get wrapped up and he does get tackled, he tends to kind of sidestep the hits rather than take them on and lower his pads into the hits to help him fall forward. So I think that's something he might need to learn at the NFL level, where he's not going to be breaking tackles as consistently. You want to lower the pads into contact and fall forward a little bit better than he does. That's not to say he never does that. He is willing to lower his pads into contact. Like, it's not something that he refuses to do. It's just something I'd like to see him do maybe on a more frequent basis in scenarios where he's likely to get tackled. So athletically, I think that McBride is kind of where I have questions about McBride. He can defeat safety angles. I've seen him do that on tape, but that's against the lower level of competition, right? The AAC is not the SEC, and the SEC isn't the NFL. The NFL players are going to be a lot faster. They're going to be a lot more physical. They're going to be a lot stronger. It's also true for linebackers. He bursts past linebackers on a regular basis at the level of competition that he was playing. That's where I have a question of whether or not it's going to translate in the NFL. He wasn't able to test in the pre-draft process. I think he was dealing with a hamstring injury, so we don't have those numbers. But it doesn't look like he has a ton of burst on tape to me. Excuse me. So he also does not break away runs that end up in touchdowns, right? He gets caught from behind regularly. So he clearly doesn't have the top end speed that you'd expect from the most explosive running backs in the NFL. He gets caught from behind by opposing secondary members and does not pull away from safeties and corners, right? He's only able to, at best, maintain that gap. I'd say he's probably, in the high 5.5s, maybe, or 4.5s, 5.6 range. And I hope it's not worse than that, right? But you can be that in the NFL and still be an incredibly effective runner. I mean, Josh Jacobs ran a 4.6 flat. I don't think you need to be a super burner, but I do think it limits your ceiling just in terms of how explosive you become at the NFL level, right? The lack of ability to break away long runs is going to be a downside for him. I'm not sure he's going to end up being a feature back, I should say, in the NFL. Another big question I have about him is ball security. So McBride fumbled once every 49 touches in college, which is just a crazy high rate. Adrian Peterson was once every 70, almost 80 touches. I think it was like once every 79 touches. Dalvin Cook is in that same range as what Adrian Peterson was. Like, there's only one player in the NFL last year who fumbled at a higher rate than McBride did throughout the entirety of his college career, right? So it wasn't just an aberration low season. The one player was Melvin Gordon, who got cut like pretty much immediately by the Broncos because he could not stop fumbling through half of the season, right? And the Broncos needed running backs last year because Javonte Williams got hurt. So like the fumble rate is extremely concerning for McBride. It's something he's going to have to clean up, and I think he carries the ball pretty well. He tucks it high and tight, and he tucks it in the correct arm, from the outside. It doesn't really hang down from his frame. Like I think it was DeMarco Murray who used to like have the ball completely hang down, or maybe it was Darren McFadden who used to basically like let the ball free hang down from his frame, right? McBride doesn't do that, but I think what it comes from is he likes to struggle for extra yards so much, and it's a positive trait for him in terms of, it does get him extra yards, and he was very effective after contact, but he does it to the point where defenders are able to knock the ball out, and he's focusing on trying to do other things, and maybe he loses track of exactly where the ball is, and that's what causes the issue, right? How many fumbles in the NFL level do you see that get overturned upon review, where it turns out, oh yeah, the player's knee actually wasn't down because they were trying as hard as they can to extend forward as far as they can, right? So the other thing with McBride is he was not a pass catcher at all at UAB. He had like 5 catches throughout his college career. He barely ran any routes. When he ran routes, they were smoke routes, that sort of thing. UAB had another back who, Jermaine Burton, maybe, I forget his name, I apologize, it's slipping my mind here, who they used on routes often, who had way more receptions than McBride. So it wasn't just UAB didn't throw the ball to running backs at all. No, it was they specifically didn't throw the ball to McBride, right? He had very limited receptions on tape. The one reception he seemed to be fine in terms of hand technique, but it was a smoke route, right? It was just a quick flat route, rather. So really, there wasn't anything technically difficult about executing that play. I did like his pass protection. I think he's a stout player, and you kind of see that with his ability to break tackles and that sort of thing. But I also think he was a good pass protector. He shows the ability to read opposing blitzes very well, which is something that you need for a pass protector. He can target the most dangerous man when there are multiple unblocked defenders coming at him. He chooses the right one. He can stymie opposing players. The one time he didn't stymie somebody, it was against a huge defensive tackle, right? So he's not going to hold up against defensive tackles. He can choose the wrong angle a couple times. There are a couple things for him to clean up in pass protection, but overall I thought he was very good for a college running back, right? So that's something that I thought was nice. So with McBride, obviously the Vikings have a huge hole in the running room. I think he can fill in as a runner. I guess I'm not as thrilled about him as some players. Like, his burst is a concern. If he shows the ability to have burst and shows the ability to execute at an NFL level in terms of a running player, like if he's got the speed to be able to do it, if he's got the athleticism to be able to play at the NFL level, I think he's going to be a quality runner at the NFL level. Obviously, we have a huge question mark about his pass catching. I think he can play on third downs because of his pass protection ability, and maybe he's an outlet option in the running back game. I don't think he's, given the fact that he was never used as a receiver in college, I think it's unlikely that he's going to turn into some great receiver in the NFL, right? So it's not, I'd have an expectation for him to be a scat back, but he can be a power back, be a run down short yardage type of back in the NFL. I think could be a solid role to project him to, with the potential to be more if he can figure it out as a receiver in the passing game, and also has the requisite athleticism, which I'm not sure he has based on tape.
So to me, if I can just tack on here at the end, the thing that is my opinion of our running back situation. It's not so much an opinion on McBride specifically. I've never been a huge Madison guy. Like, I think, it's not that I don't think he's a good player. I just think, he's okay. And I think we have a lot of okay in that room right now.
Yeah.
And I think that could present opportunities for someone like
I agree. I think Madison to me is clearly the best back in the backfield, but like Madison's a guy you're okay with having be your starter at running back, not necessarily to me that you want to be your starter at running back, right? Like there's a distinction between those two things where it's
Definitely.
like, hey, if another better option comes along, we're going to be absolutely willing to go with that over Alex Madison, I think. And I think that's true for most of the fan base. I think he will be a solid all around running back, Madison, this year, but if somebody else is able to step up, whether that's Chandler, who seems to have some smoke from the team, or Wongwu, or McBride, like it wouldn't shock me if any of those three players were able to earn a significant role.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well, we are trucking along here. We did it, Matt. We've got one more player to discuss, and this is a player who wasn't really on my radar until you mentioned to me, and you pointed out you were really enjoying his tape, and that
Yes.
is Ivan Pace Jr., one of our undrafted free agency pickups. Tell us a little bit about Ivan Pace, what your expectations might be for him, his rookie season. Are you still excited as you were when you mentioned him a couple months ago? Like, talk to me. What's going on here? Ivan Pace.
Yeah,
Uh,
so by my count, I saw a list online that didn't have the Vikings listed as spending the most guaranteed money in the UDFA pool, but then I also went on Spotrac, which I prefer over the cap to Spotrac, but Spotrac I just had an easier time finding what was guaranteed to UDFAs. And I tallied it up, and the Vikings came in at higher than the highest total, which I think the other team that was high was the Chiefs. Um, but we gave $300,000 to Andre Carter, which, to my understanding, is the most given out by any team this year to a single player guaranteed. Andre Carter, obviously the edge rusher who went to Army, I wasn't able to find tape on him. I wasn't able to find any Army defense, so I was planning to watch him as well. I just didn't get it because it wasn't available to me. But Ivan Pace, I did have all of Cincinnati's last year. Um, and the Vikings gave him tied for the fifth most money in UDFA. So that's behind Andre Carter. I forget exactly who he's tied with, but he got $236,000 guaranteed. So when you're giving out that much guaranteed money, if you cut a player that becomes dead cap, which, you don't really want as a team, right? It's not a killer to have, but if you can avoid a $300,000 charge for a player who is an undrafted free agent, like I think you would. So I think Pace has a pretty decent shot of making the team, right? Just based out of the money that they paid him. Um, so Pace played at Miami of Ohio for the beginning of his college career before I think it was a grad transfer to Cincinnati last year. Obviously, the year before, Cincinnati had a great run where they went to the college football playoff. They weren't quite as good this past season, but they were still a very respectable team and one of the better group of five teams overall. Um, a lot of people had him as a draft worthy prospect, or a lot of people also had Andre Carter as a draft worthy prospect, right? Pace on Arif's consensus board was 151 overall, right? That's solidly in the Jaquelin Roy range of the draft. Um, so, he could have gone there. He was extremely productive. He had 136 total tackles, 20.5 tackles for loss, and 9.0 sacks, right? So, like, he was an extremely, extremely productive player at Cincinnati. He's not that old. I think he's 22, going on 23, which was around the middle of the pack for players in this year's draft. And he was actually younger than everybody we've talked about, with the exception of Jordan Addison and DeWayne McBride. So, of the draft picks, of the 6 Vikings draft picks, Pace was younger than all but 2 of them. So that's kind of interesting. Uh, I will say, I think I figured out pretty quickly why he went undrafted, right? Why his stock fell so much in the draft, and it's a combination of 2 things. So the first thing is that Pace is 5'10", right? He's actually pretty stout at 5'10" at 231 pounds. A lot of NFL linebackers, like Kendricks, was in the high 230s at 6 foot tall. So it's not that much of a stretch from 5'10" and a half at 231 to have that frame play at the NFL, but it was his role, right? I mentioned that he had 9.0 sacks. He was primarily a pass rusher at Cincinnati. And his pass rush role wasn't quite as an edge rusher. It was actually kind of interesting. They ran 3 down linemen a lot. and had Pace as a linebacker off the line of scrimmage, but closer to the line of scrimmage than you'd see a off-ball linebacker traditionally play. So he was like 3 yards deep and would attack the line of scrimmage at the snap every play. It worked out really well for him. Like, he's a ball of energy on the field, right? He consistently gives high effort. He showed great get off. He showed a variety of pass rush moves. But once again, I should mention as well that he had, I believe, 30-inch arms. So at 6 foot, at 6 foot, I'm sorry, at 5'10" with just 30-inch arms, that's not something that's going to translate into an effective edge rusher in the NFL, right? Which is what you'd potentially be asking him to do if you played him at outside linebacker for the Vikings. So he's going to have to play off-ball linebacker. And that's not to say he didn't do off-ball linebacker things at Cincinnati. He did. He was just primarily a pass rusher and only did the off-ball linebacker things occasionally. The other thing that's important to note here is because he started out so close to the line of scrimmage, his run defense and his reading his keys in run defense is going to be a little bit different than if he starts at a traditional linebacker depth. So he was asked a lot of times just to go at the line of scrimmage, and you might have to read a little bit more as a traditional linebacker. I did like his willingness to take on bigger players. He's got violent hands. He uses a number of tactics to disengage, but he will be overpowered if he's asked to hold ground in the run defense. So if you have a double team that comes up to the second layer level at a linebacker, Ivan Pace has to go around that double team. And he's very quick. He's very good with his hands. He's good at getting around that double team, but he can't take that block head on. And I think that's going to be a little bit of a problem for the Vikings as we get further, unless our defensive linemen become very, very stout, right? Overall, like, I think we've got a solid defensive line rotation, but I don't know if we have the stoutness to keep linebackers clean all the time. And if we want to say replace Jordan Hicks with an Ivan Pace, we're going to end up with Brian Asamoah, who's also a smaller player who would struggle, I think, to directly take on blocks, and Ivan Pace as our primary linebackers. That could be a concern because we don't have anybody who can directly take on blocks from linemen and could get run over by teams that run, duo and stuff like that. So like I said, I think his size limits his pass rush potential, but he's an incredible blitzer, right? So he's going to be great going up against tight ends. He's going to be great going up against running backs as a blitzer at the NFL level. I think he reads plays well in run defense. Like I said, he follows pullers in run defense, so that's a key. And this is in a more off-ball position, which he did play some of. It just wasn't necessarily his primary role. Like, I would say it was more split, 50% of the time he was a pass rush player or a QB spy or somebody who was in the run fit as somebody who was attacking the line of scrimmage. And then, maybe 25% in other coverages, like a short zone coverage, and then 25% as more of an off-ball run defense player, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So, another thing I was really impressed with is his ability to work through traffic. So he can avoid linemen at that level like it's absolutely nothing. He can avoid tight ends. He can work through traffic to the edges, and he's very fast to the edges, right? He ran a 4.6. So his athletic testing, I think, is actually pretty good for a player at his position. His RAS came out at 5.7, but I think that was primarily due to his size. He also had kind of a negative short shuttle. So he ran a 4.62. He had a very bad 1.7 10-yard split, but I don't think that number translated to the field at all. So there might have been something wonky going on with his 10-yard split where he just didn't get out of the blocks well, right? You're in a sprinter stance. That could have been an issue there. I'm not worried about his burst off of the line, so that 1.7 10-yard split doesn't really bother me. His vertical was okay at 35 inches. Like, that's a very respectable, you can play in the NFL number. It's just not an impressive one. His 3-cone at 4.718, also kind of the same thing. Respectable, but not one where you're like, oh, wow, this guy's an athletic super freak, right? So I think he's a good athlete, but not a great athlete. But he makes up for that kind of with some of his instincts and his explosion on the field. He does wrap and tackle, like he shows the ability to do that, but he's inconsistent in doing so. Like he'll dive at feet, he'll work pretty hard. Another thing I saw throughout his tape is that he ends up on the ground a lot. I think a lot of that is part of his willingness to just go, right? And I think he was coached to just go. And if you end up getting knocked down, it's not that big of a deal. Obviously, he's a smaller player taking on bigger linemen, but I know scouts hate players that get knocked on the ground. Like, I know it's something that they don't like to see, so it's something that could have caused him to fall as well. But with him, I think, like, when he gets knocked on the ground, it also shows his athleticism because he's able to get up very quickly and recover that, and even make impact on plays based off of that sometimes. So, like I said, he's got easy sideline to sideline speed in the run defense. And if we flip over to pass coverage, he was very effective as a quarterback spy. He tracked down quarterbacks well and made pass deflections. There were only 1 or 2 reps, and this is out of, 50 plus reps as a quarterback spy. Honestly, he was used as a spy quite a bit, where the quarterback ended up getting the better of him and running past him. So I think he was really impressive as a quarterback spy. He lacks experience in anything but basic zones. He was able to follow the quarterback's eyes to get some pass deflections, and he's able to cover running backs in the flats in man coverage. He can carry opposing players to the second level. So what I mean by that is, when you're a linebacker, sometimes your rule will say, okay, you take the tight end until the tight end runs past you, and then it's the safety's job to cover that. So he'll cover the tight end, run with him, and let the safety, and then fall off and let the safety once the tight end gets past a certain landmark. He also showed the speed to cover a player up the seam in a Tampa 2 coverage, right, which is a rare thing to do. There was 1 rep where he did that, so I was pretty impressed. He does show the ability of where to put his hands to get a pass deflection against, I want to say it was Kentucky. It might have been a different team, but it might have been Kentucky. There was a sequence of plays where he chased the quarterback to the edge and pushed him out of bounds for a sack, covered a tight end in the flat, just completely smothered the tight end in the flat, then came back to the quarterback was scrambling to force a throwaway, or once again force the quarterback out of bounds. Made a big play in the hole where he sidestepped the lineman and made a tackle in the hole. And this was in a goal line situation. And then on 4th down, covered a tight end across the formation. The quarterback throws it up. The tight end goes up for a jump ball. He catches it initially, but Pace gets his arm in there and punches the ball out. So I think he's got pretty good ball skills. Or it might have been 3 plays there, but that stretch was incredibly impressive from him. So I liked Pace as a player a lot. Like I said, he's going to have to align different in the NFL level, and I wonder if that changes his keys and maybe his play speed a little bit as he adjusts to the NFL. But I think for the Vikings specifically, he's going to be very useful early on as a blitz player. I mentioned that 5-0 front earlier with Jaquelin Roy. I think Pace fits in very well there. It's where you put him at the line of scrimmage, you ask him to do stunts where he either crashes against an offensive lineman, and he ran stunts that the Vikings are literally going to run, where he was lined up as a nose tackle against the center, crashed in one direction, and actually got to the quarterback because he was quick enough to get past the center in that scenario. He also was lined up as a nose tackle and looped around the edge and got to the quarterback. Those are stunts that are in the Vikings playbooks. One of them is called a tank stunt. The other one's called, I believe, a hot stunt, right? So it's like literally things that are in the Vikings playbook that he was executing at a high level and being successful with in college. So I think that will translate to the NFL. And I think as a sub-package player who's a blitzer, a quarterback spy, that sort of thing, he'll have a role immediately on the Vikings.
Well, that all sounds awesome. The one thing I would like to tack on here, just what little I've been exposed to him. Obviously, I haven't sat there and watched everything the way that you do. And I would urge our listeners, if you pick one highlight reel out of this whole group, I really mean this. If that's your thing, love to watch a highlight reel just to kind of get a feel for a player or whatever, and you only have time for one guy on this list, 2 episodes, I would go watch Ivan Pace, because I love his, that sort of that antiquated scouting term that everyone pretends to hate, but I think still is very real, is a guy's motor.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ivan Pace plays every snap like it's his last snap. And
Yes.
I love that in a player. I love that in a player. It's one of the things that I love about Brian Asamoah. You've already mentioned him. And that's one of those things when I see that in a guy, I know that, okay, maybe he has limitations. Maybe it won't work out because of X, Y, Z, but I know that it won't be because he didn't try. And like he's gonna if you put him on the field, he's gonna give you 100% every
Hmm.
snap. And I think that is not coachable. I think that's something that just a guy has or doesn't have. I like Ivan Pace. I'm rooting for him because of you, Matt. So we'll
Yeah,
see how it goes here.
I would agree. I would reinforce that. Guys, football, there's a lot of independent work that you have to do in football on your own outside of the range of the coaching staff. Like NFL coaches are, focused on implementing their scheme, they're focused on game planning, they're focused on preparing you the best you can to play your opponent, but the baseline techniques and a lot of the work outside of that is left on the players to do themselves. So, it's not a foolproof method, right? But there's no way we can really evaluate that off field component from the players besides watching the tape and kind of seeing how they process things that are going on in front of them and also how hard they try. So I think seeing how hard a player tries absolutely matters. And I think it could be an indication that they're going to continue to do that at the NFL level and they're going to learn outside of football, and that drive and that love of the game and the passion for it is going to help them go beyond maybe their athleticism in their careers. So
Absolutely. That's as always, Matt. You say it much more eloquently. That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah, absolutely, man. We did it. We got through all of the notable rookies from our draft and
mm-hmm.
one of our undrafted free agents, and obviously our roster has ballooned to something like 90. I think it's like 92
It's
players or
90
something.
players, 91 maybe with the international exemption for Junior Aho. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think it's 91 players total as we're
So
starting training camp.
who knows what's going to happen here in the coming months? But it's an exciting time to be a fan of an NFL team and, of course, the Vikings. Any last thoughts before we wrap this one up here, Matt?
Honestly, if I had any more thoughts, I don't know where it is. My brain's pretty empty at this point, and we just rattled off a bunch of stuff on these guys. So I think I can't really come up with anything else for you right now.
I think you've said more than enough, and I think our listeners have gotten a lot of really great info from you these last two episodes, and I appreciate your effort, Matt. Thank you very much for doing this for us because it's fun and it's fun to listen to you break these guys down. Um, you can find Matt on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now.
We're gonna go with Twitter.
We'll go with Twitter. You can find that on Twitter at Fries Football. You can find our other co-host who wasn't able to join us this week, Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL. And you can find me on Instagram at You've Been Gregged. You can find the show on YouTube by checking out Kindred Skulls. And you can also find us on Twitter at Kindred Skulls. Give us a listen. Follow us all year. I think we're coming up on 100 episodes or something pretty soon here.
We're in like the 70s, I think, but
70s.
still, it's pretty good.
Oh, never mind. We don't have a preseason schedule yet. It's probably going to end up being weekly, but it depends a little bit on all of our schedules. So we'll work all that out, and we hope that you'll be patient with us. And we're looking forward to the season. Let's go, 2023. Let's go.
Yeah, Skull Vikings.
Skull Vikings. Matt, have a great rest of your day, man.
Everybody listening, have a great rest of your day.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Oh, baby. The first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score.